Legitimate complaints against their teachings include the untenable idea of a corruptible God implicit therein, repulsive to every philosophic mind of the age. The difficulty of the Trinitarian dogma was intensified by what looks like crude polytheism, their greatly exaggerated dualism, evil or matter being all but equal to God, as among many ignorant Christians even today, with its consequent hate of the body, led to the exaltation of virginity, already the mood of that age, and of asceticism in food, etc. This was, of course, suited and practicable only for world renouncers and monks. All religions have a substratum of myth carried over from the childhood of the race, when where did it come from, who made it, are natural questions. The Bible stories of Adam and Eve, Noah and Jonah, are adapted to the mental age of about 6, but the Manichaean myths were in elaborating the grand Gnostic concepts of Sophia and the prodigal son even more childish and incoherent than these, and they were rightly rejected by an age which could produce an Augustine, an Origen, and the great Neoplatonists and Stoics. The grand truth of God's omnipresence, immanent in every speck of what we call matter, though almost instinctive in lands permeated by Upanishadic thought, seemed merely funny to the less philosophic, less mature West. To its spokesmen it seemed a fitting butt for sarcasm and for undergraduate humor, which sometimes transgressed the ordinary canons of decency. But we must remember that Manichaean vegetarianism was imposed on, and voluntarily adopted by, only the elect, as it is equally imposed on the Carmelites today. It is no funnier in the one case than in the other, nor is it in either case sprung from hypocritical claims to purity. Ignorance of the real reason for its adoption, too suitable for superficial thinkers, does not justify ridicule. Persecution started as soon as the Christians had power in their own hands under Constantine, and it drove Manichaeism largely underground. The inevitable secrecy of their rites and the hiding of their scriptures from bigoted pyromancies gave the Christians the same excuse for inventing scandal against them as, under similar circumstances, the pagans had used against themselves. The known Manichaean contempt for marriage and entangling the spirit still deeper in matter thus naturally led to charges of immorality and of sex aberration, to which the little we know of the Manichaeans, in fact most emphatically, do not point. Lastly, the ignorance of the original languages of Manichaean scriptures among Christian priests and writers forced them to rely almost wholly on what had been translated and could circulate freely in their own Latin or Greek. Unhappily, the translators seem to have attached far too much importance to their myth, whose absurdities were obvious to all but the pious believers. Where they presented to the devotional side, as in the books of the Psalms, the appeal was direct, and its effect was great and immediate. But beyond all other reasons for the Christian hatred of Mani and his church stood the simple fact that it alone, after the failure of the anti-feminist Mithraism, could meet it as a rival on equal terms in nearly every phase of religious life and teaching, and far excelled it on the life after death. Mazdi and Parsis. Underlying all outer causes for their hatred for Mani was certainly the dark suspicion that he had secret political motives. A scion of the overthrown Parthian house, he could and did receive help and support nowhere in the empire more than in the old Parthian homeland around Khorasan, and in Armenia where the fallen dynasty still survived. Loyalty to the Mazdian state of the Sassanids inevitably depended on loyalty to the Sassanid faith of Zarathustra, in the face of which Manichaeism did, in a warlike age, only seem a foreign innovation corrupted by Chaldean myths and contemptible Christian effeminacies like gentleness and humanity. Nietzsche and Bahram I might well have become good friends. Dr. Dahl, in his Zoroastrian theology, lists specific oppositions between the rival faiths. 1. While Manichaeism sought to draw the good soul out of an evil world, Mazdaism taught the soul to fight under God to banish evil from the world. 2. While Mani said the flesh is evil and the soul should flee from the body, Mazdaism says that only the passions are evil and that the soul must strengthen its body as an ally in the spiritual war. 3. Mani held marriage impure, a hindrance to union with God, and childbearing a sin that imprisons God. i.e. the soul, in flesh. Zarathustra had taught that celibacy is a vice, and man's duty is to rear up children to be God's warriors. 4. While Mani said that property tempts the soul away from reliance on God and increases worldliness, Mazdaism holds that honestly earned and wisely expended wealth is meritorious and mendicancy is a hateful thing. 5. Mani believed in subduing the body through fasting and penitential prayer, while the Parsis hold that fasting, which weakens the body to be used in God's war with evil, is a great sin. The unbiased student can certainly see the truth in both points of view. But the two great faiths had much in common: their concepts of the origin of evil, the ages of struggle and the eventual triumph of good, the idea that God is manifest in great forms, like the Ameshaspentas and the emanations, their ideas of the Savior's descent to rescue the light on which darkness has aggressed, of the maiden image embodying the merits of the righteous in the hour of death, and of the ascent of the liberated soul to Behisht, the land of light, and many, many others were almost identical. The enmity between them may well base partly on the envy of the Magi, intolerant of any possible rival system, but it seems equally due to blind patriotism and xenophobia as to any philosophic divergence from the people's norm at the time. Muslims. At first they were attracted by the simplicity of its organization, so like their own, its freedom from a ritualistic and idolatrous priesthood, as that of the Christians seemed to them its reverence for scriptures so like their own for the Holy Quran. It was only when being identified with Iraq and Persia it began to incur suspicion of alliance with Ali's fallen family that it fell from the favor of the Umayyads. The Abbasids came to power through a revolt in Khorasan, no doubt aided by the large Manichaean elements there, so the early sultans favored it again, until they found that the lure of Persian learning to which Manichaean studies led was slowly drawing important Muslims away from their own God-given faith. Then intolerance became the rule. The Manichaeans were henceforth safe only where, as in Toguzguz, they were physically strong enough to threaten reprisals. Most fled from Islamic lands to the peaceful Tarim Basin and the outlying plains of Khiva and Samarkand. Here they showed in their day of power that tolerance to be expected of them, and it was probably the ravages of Tartar and Mongol which at last blotted out the faith. But on the whole the Muslims seem to have been the least cruel of all the enemies of Manichaeism. Confucians. Here, too, the causes for hatred were somewhat involved. First, the foreign origin, always enough to prejudice the somewhat complacent Chinese mind. Then, the dark suspicion of hidden political scheming, for which the Manichaeans, in AD 821, certainly gave some grounds. As in the West, persecution forced them to meet in secret under the cover of night, and here, too, this led to charges of vile rites, sorcery by means of the names of foreign gods, necromancy, and the like. The adaptability necessary if a religion is to spread beyond its homeland led to their adoption of Buddhist and Taoist legends, names, and doctrines, and this led to Manichaeism being regarded as a deceitful heresy. The strict vegetarianism of the elect and their ascetic life seemed a standing reproach against the principles of their own great prophet and sage Confucius. Their very kindness and countless charities to the people seemed an underhanded ruse to entice them away from the sound rules of life held by their ancestors from time immemorial, just as in our own times in the case of foreign Christian missionaries. China has always been suspicious of and hostile to innovations, particularly those coming from abroad. 7. Can a religion die? In combating German militarism, mankind has twice in our days been taught that violent resistance does not achieve its end. It merely spreads the evil into new fields of activity. The vanquished infect their victors with their own disease. Apparently, the free world has yet to learn that the same is true in fighting communism. Atom bombs and a sanitary cordon only spread the unwanted system further and convert those most bitterly opposed to it. The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the Church, said Tertullian. Persecution may drive out from a body its weaker members, but it strengthens the strong and draws in brave and sturdy souls from outside. Thus the persecuted faith grows stronger, the more its foes try to strangle it with their violence. Yet in the story of Manichaeism, history does show that a faith can be destroyed by persistent and widespread brutality. The outer form of it at least vanishes from the earth. Its name is no longer feared or hated by its rivals. It goes underground. Where is Manichaeism today? A superficial glance would answer, nowhere, it is dead. Look again. The physical body of this great religion, once spread over the known portions of 3 continents, has indeed vanished. All physical forms and bodies are perishable, fleeting, even our own. All external churches and creeds, founded by infinite wisdom, mediated through the goodness and labors of great saints, to help, inspire, and guide mankind on the road to God. They serve their time and later centuries, but at last they fade and disappear. Some still lingering on the earth are visibly doing that even now. Yet as the body of each one of us will vanish in its turn, dissolved back into the inchoate elements of earth, to be reused, modified by our children's children, while the soul lives on its timeless life under its own conditions, so too, while the names and forms of a religion vanish, return to the vast ocean of the subconscious mind, thence to arise again and again, as Young has shown us, in modified forms of human thought and faith. The soul of that religion lives on unshaken in the dreams, aspirations, and ideals of mankind. It was so with Manichaeism. Built upon the noble life, the love and devotion of the founder and his early followers, formalized by the scriptures which they left behind, encouraged to heroic self-abnegation and victorious evangelism by the cruelty they always had to face, lit and rejoiced by the glory promised to the faithful after death's brief pains, the religion of light served its time and disappeared from our eyes. Yet the light of religion still shines upon us, and being the inevitable product of the human mind, illumines even the humanist side of materialistic communism as well, though it be the greatest seeming enemy of religion in our present-day world. Manichaean thought survived in the ascetic life of countless monks and nuns striving for sainthood against the restless clamor of the world, the flesh and the devil, in the passionate personal love for God and the spouse of the human spirit so typical of Catholic, Sufi, and Sikh devotion, in the fierce defense of God as being all good, totally opposed to the very existence of any kind of evil, which characterizes many sects today, even in the childish love of fairy stories, so typical of the 7-year-old, which produced the myth of man out of the rags and tatters of 100 earlier forms, and which in our present world still fashions myths of other kinds. The proper study of mankind is man, said Pope. All that the human mind has produced is of interest to the truly Catholic, i.e., the cultured human mind. Whether that product of human thought still lingers visibly among us in the present, or has faded into the mists of a forgotten past, it is still our concern, still gives delight in its sympathetic study. The dead religion is as vital as those still deemed to be alive. There is no death. What seems so is transition. The poet declared of the human soul, and it is equally true of every human thought. Like the wave from a stone dropped in the water, it goes on and on through all space and eternal time. 8. On the rationale of dualism. The way dualists reason is well shown by the following epitome drawn from Zoroastrian theology by Dr. M. N. Dalla, the eminent Parsi scholar, with which the Manichaean would be in full agreement. Evil is as complete and independent as good, sharing with it the pairs of opposites. God cannot be the source of both, or he would be a contradiction and a chaos. If evil comes from him, he cannot be all good, or deserve our worship. If he is all good, good only should exist, but evil too exists, so it must be independent of his will. If he, for some purpose, wills both good and evil, then his will, he himself, is imperfect. If he wills only good, then someone else wills evil, the devil. To say God created evil that man might choose and value good is to say he poisons men that they may seek the cure. The all-wise God would not will to create his own opponent. If he did not foresee the consequences of such a creation, he is not omniscient. If he created evil as a test or means of training, then he is cruel and not good. The wise could not knowingly produce an enemy to afflict and even destroy men. The wise always act for the good and happiness of all. As the devil is always for the hurt of all beings, God must have been unwise to create him. If God cannot uproot evil, then he is imperfect, ignorant. But he is perfect and does know how to uproot evil, being both merciful, all-knowing, and omnipotent. He both can and will ultimately destroy evil. Quoting from SG 51, 95 through 97, if it be said that the adversary was created originally good by Ormazd, i.e. God, from whom he afterwards revolted and became evil, then it shows that the adversary possesses a more powerful will than that of the sacred being, since in that even the power of evil is thus able to break his commandment and diffuse more harm in the world than the good of the sacred being. God should not then have created a rival thus to defy and to triumph over him, and God is to blame for creating in the devil so strong a will, tending to all evil. If it is to be compensated later on, this shows God's inefficiency, being unable to give happiness in heaven without first giving misery in the world. God cannot be both good and evil, blessing and cursing, helping and injuring, nor could he harm his creatures and still be their friend. All evil comes from the evil spirit trying to take this world to be his own. God cannot create evil and then punish men for falling into it, and still be just. No justice could inflict a boundless punishment for a limited sin, or give endless pain to his creatures for yielding to the evil he has himself produced. But as God is infinitely just, evil cannot be produced by him. If he is merciful, he cannot let demons loose among his children to afflict and ruin them. If he can destroy evil and does not, yet punishes the wicked, he is neither just nor merciful. He created the world for a wise purpose, for happiness, so he cannot will ruin and slaughter. This must be the will of a hurtful evil spirit. If it be said evil arises from man's perverted will, and man is set up to frustrate his Creator's will to good, this too is injustice, for when God has to punish the wicked, he could not have created in them a will that leads to sin and penalty. Man falls into sin because his goodness is imperfect, corrupted by the evil spirit. Evil is primeval and does not arise from the will of man, but is rather associated with the dominance of flesh over spirit, or, as the Manichaean would add, is inherent in the very nature of flesh, of matter itself. Answers to all this have been framed by those opposed to the dualistic view, but this is not the place for considering their validity or otherwise. It is a tremendous problem, the crux of all human philosophy, how to reconcile the omnipotence and omnipresence of good, whereon faith must ever rely, with the obvious existence of its active opposite, and the last word thereon will probably never be spoken while man is only man. 9. The organism of the Church. The Manichaeans were organized in a five-rank hierarchy symbolized by the five-stepped bema and relating to the five stages of spiritual unfoldment in the human and divine mind. On the pinnacle of this pyramid, like the messenger on his bema, sat the personal successor of the prophet, the leader, Coptic Archegos, Persian Athrapaiti, Urped High Prelate, Imam, Chaldean Fachu, and Chinese Fachu, the king of the religion, was like all the senior Manichaeans, at first a wanderer among the churches. His diocese was the world from Spain to China, where the faith had penetrated. His work was to encourage amid persecution, to prevent corruption of the teaching, to guard against any falling away from the founder's lofty ideal of life. The first 7 leaders died as martyrs, and then some fixed place where the supreme authority could be found was needed, so their successors came to reside at the capital Ctesiphon, and then at Baghdad, until they were forced by prudence to withdraw to the safer Samarkand, and finally, so it seems, to the Chinese borderlands. 1. Under this father were the 12 masters or teachers, Persian Afursanar, Chinese Afuyinsa or Mosho, Pelasgian Hrebatagan, Sogdian Mwok, Turk Mozag. Like the Christian apostles, each of these took one country for his scene of labor. There they organized the churches, and touring constantly from place to place, held the faithful loyal to their ideals. They were known as the sons of gentleness or patience, and Chinese texts tell us they were in charge of the blessings, presumably of mankind. 2. Next, their sphere, perhaps limited to provinces, came the 70 or 72 illuminates, or overseers. These were sometimes called bishops and were known as the sons of knowledge. They were, we are told, in special charge of doctrine. 3. The third rank was that of the elders or priests. They were called the sons of reason or intelligence. Each was in charge of a single local church, and responsible for reciting the scriptures, prayers, hymns, and confessions of public ritual and worship. 4. We now come to the elect, Persian Denuar, Pelasgian Vitidagan, Turkic Dintar, Chinese Tsiyuan-ken, Armenian Sadikin, the true. A word which later corrupted into Zandik became a contemptuous term for dualistic heretics. These were called the sons of discretion or secrecy, doubtless because the esoteric teachings and explanations were entrusted to them. Unable to enter their order, St. Augustine wrote against them with all the bitterness of frustration. Their other names in Persian, the celibates and the righteous pure ones, bespeak the lofty character of their life, and down to the later Middle Ages among the Cathari, their history belies the unworthy slanders of the Christian polemist, who saw his own boyhood vices reflected outward on the lives of others. They were easily picked out for persecution by their paleness and ascetic looks, and even by their enemies no word could be uttered against their gentleness, courage, and nobility. They are compared in GPM 40-41 and in Kephaliah 83 to the perfect pearl sought out by the divine fisherman. Like their superiors, the elect too had to live lives of ceaseless wandering. The temples, Turkic Kaidan, Chinese Chaitan, or Fatan, had a library, a lecture hall, Hermeneia, a hospital, a place of worship, and a refectory, being fivefold like everything else Manichaean. But they had no dwelling rooms. The elect took monastic vows to regard no place as their home on this material plane, but moved here and there preaching the faith to all, and sleeping as guests of hearers, or under the trees. Their only property might be a single black robe, to be replaced each year when worn out. They might not labor with their hands or earn a living, but must depend wholly on pious offerings, and when hearers did not bring them any food on a certain day, they might beg that evening. They must always deal humbly and gently with the outer world, and carefully avoid giving even the slightest pain or offense to animals or plants. So they naturally forswore meat, eggs, strong drink, and agriculture, which includes weeding, pruning, and the killing of insects, pests. Their food was limited to a single meal a day, to be taken in the evening, with a light collation in the morning. They fasted very often, and observed the great Chakshapad fast during the month when the sun moves through Aquarius and Pisces, ended by the great Bema festival. They might not build or own a house, nor even be alone by day or night, lest the breath of slander blow upon them, nor might they even touch a member of the other sex, even while accepting food at their hands. A Manichaean made no other distinction between men and women. It is pleasing to learn, and it is certain that the higher ranks were open to all alike. Apparently, membership of this order accrued to those able to control their passions and to live up to the very high demands the rank required of them. 5. Those who could not embrace these lofty ways of life formed the masses of the Manichaean Church, the hearers or catechumens, of whom St. Augustine once was one. Pelasgian Miosagan, Turkic Nigoshak, Chinese Ting Cho, Coptic Catechumeni. They were known as the sons of inquiry or understanding, and were bound by the simple code of the Manichaean 10 precepts, or Chakshapat, and observed the 4 daily prayers, adding the 3 optional hours when they could. They undertook to partake and support the religion, to train for its service a child of their own, an orphan or a slave, to accept the onerous duties of the higher orders. They were allowed to marry one wife only, and might labor in the fields, but were totally forbidden to take any part in war. Every Sunday was a fast to them till a common meal at sunset, and they spent most of the day at prayer, or hearing the Scriptures read and explained. There was also a partial fast on 7 days in every month, Mondays also being days of prayer in honor of Mani's death that day. Kneeling, they offered to the elect of their own local church a sacramental alms, miazda, consisting of wafers with fruits and vegetables like melons, grapes, and cucumbers, together with fruit juices and sherbets, but of course no wine. The violence involved in producing these was no sin, because they were dedicated to the purifying of the light sparks through contact with the saints. GPM 59.2. The fragment M135 tells hearers to strive for the salvation of your souls so long as there is strength in your bodies, and to give one part of every day to social duties, another to their worldly business so as to keep the family above want, and the third to their spiritual needs. A very noble picture of the dignity of the common hearer is outlined in GPM 42 through 44 and 47. We can have no doubt whatever that great numbers of the men and women drawn to Mani's feet did much to live up to that high ideal, and then dying with their inner eyes fixed on their beloved Lord, went straight to dwell with him forever in the lovely land of light. 10. The Books of Mani. Of most of these books we possess only a very few tiny fragments, so efficient was the work of the destroyers, and we are left for the most part to speculate on what they may have contained. 1. Shapura Khan. Written first of all and in Persian, to honor King Shapur I, and perhaps to assure him that Mani had no hostile political aim. It was probably written in AD 242. Soon after he went to India. An-Nadim, Biruni, and Yaqubi name it, but the Western and Coptic writers do not seem to have known it, at least under that name. Possibly it was largely replaced by later books in the better-known Syriac. There is likelihood, however, that the Syriac Apocrypha, i.e. Hidden Things, noted by Photius, and the 9th century Greek Anathema as Mani's 4th book, may have been a translation of this. For Manichaeans were swift and efficient in translation work. It was in fact a revelation derived from Mani's angel twin, and must have contained a generally Gnostic type of cosmogenesis and eschatology. Biruni gives us the opening passage used in our GPM 31, which evidently narrated the origin of the following revelation, with an account of Mani's own birth and his call to prophethood. It probably included the long passage about death in our Appendix 1, preserved by An-Nadim, and the striking story of the Last Judgment given in M470 through 482. Yaqubi tells us that it also described the soul and the universe. It seems to have been one of An-Nadim's chief sources, including the long and unsavory story of how evil took root in Adam's family. A fragment was found in a Turfan manuscript, probably part of the whole text. 2. The Great or Living Gospel, said by Mirkan to have been written and illustrated in a Turkestan cave during a 1 year's retreat, for an illustrated copy of it is probably the same as the Ertank or Urjang, also called by Haju Chalfa the Dester Mani, Mani's Law, and in Coptic the icon or image. It is generally given first place among Mani's books, and the psalmist, MP 46, says of it, "He has the antidote that is good for every disease. There are 22 compounds in his remedy, his great gospel, the good tidings of all those who belong to the light." To this is added, MP 139, that it is the king of the writings. His New Testament, the manna of the skies, the inheritance of the earth, yet neither Faustus nor Augustine show sign of having heard of it. Biruni tells us that it contained 22 chapters, each beginning with one of the letters in the Syriac alphabet. He complains that while it refutes all Christian beliefs, the Manichaeans claim that it alone contains all truth. A Turfan list of books refers to the Aleph and Tau, first and last letters of the alphabet, Gospels, and the Gospel of the 22, which included the story of Jesus. Another fragment gives us its opening words. I, Mani, the messenger of Jesus, the friend, in the love of the Father, of the glorious one. The opening words of the epistle quoted by Augustine, following by the extract from M17 we have used in GPM 33.2. It is also seen to have belonged to several surviving fragments on the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, but in fact we know very little of its nature or contents. Photius tells us that it distorted Christ's life in a docetic sense. Diodorus of Tarsus and Heraclion refuted this. A commentary on it was carried by certain Syrians to Armenia, says Samuel of Ani. It was well known later in the West, at least by name. An illustrated copy was in the royal archives of Ghazni as late as AD 1092. It is just possible, as Alfric evidently thinks, that it was a sort of explanation of the lost Gospel of the 12, as implied by Theodore Abu Kura of Haran. Ibn ul-Murtada shows that it began with an account of the almost omnipresent King of Light who dwells in the navel of his world. Yakubi adds that it treated of prayer and the means to be used to free the spirit, while Biruni puts in that it proclaimed Mani as the comforter foretold by Christ and the seal, standard of the prophets. 3. The Treasure of Life, called in MP 139, his second great book, The Remedy and the Cures. The Shame of the Sons of Error on this MP 46 has the interesting comment, his water pot is the treasure of life. In it there is hot water, with it there is also some cold water mixed. An-Nadim calls it the Book of Vivification. The work is referred to by most writers, from Hegemonius and the Kephaliah down to the 13th century, and it evidently enjoyed popularity. The main theme seems to have been a detailed account of the myth of man. Yakubi says it taught what parts of the soul came from the pure light, and what parts proceed from the vicious darkness. From Masudi we learn that one chapter refuted the Marcionite dogma of a third, intermediary principle. Named quotations by Augustine, Euodius, and Biruni deal with various incidents briefly told in our GPM 82, 7, and 87. One of these is cited as from Book 2 and another from Book 7. It is probable that the long extracts in Severus of Antioch and in Acts 9 derive from this book, and a long section of the Chinese CMT is probably epitomized therefrom. Evidently, the need for a shorter version of the story was soon felt, and Epiphanius speaks also of a little treasure, while Cyril, Nilus, and Heraclian mention the treasures. It is quite possible that the famous fundamental epistle was in fact that epitome, or it may have been the even more enduring book, The Two Roots. Yanai, wrote a commentary on the original longer version, in Syriac Semitha, which acquired canonicity among later Manichaeans. 4. The Book of Mysteries, whereof MP 46 says, his knife for cutting is the Book of the Mysteries, which implies that it was largely a polemic or refutatory work, to prune away ulcerous doctrines from the world. An-Nadim gives us a list of its 18 chapters which support this idea. It evidently dealt with the esoteric life of Jesus, from a Gnostic angle, refuted the special teachings of both Bardesan and the Hebrew prophets, as several later writers also aver, and clarified Mani's own relationship to his Gnostic predecessors. The nature of soul and body was defined, and according to Biruni, who quotes from chapter 12, 13, and 18, clearly it taught reincarnation as a purgatorial misery till the world's end. Biruni adds that Mani adopted this doctrine while in India. At least a part of the book was in the form of a dialogue between Jesus and his apostles, as often in Gnostic and later apocryphal literature. Alfaric deems it probably an answer to the Book of Mysteries used by Bardesan's followers. Commented on by Abdiel in the Apostolic Age, it was known to most authorities down to the time of Razi, AD 1000, who quoted from it with enthusiastic praise, as Biruni tells us. From Al-Ranshari, the later cites the passage we have used in GPM 25, from a context denying that Manichaeans idolatrously worship the sun and the moon, which must have been a very early charge against them. 5. The pragmateia, i.e., what ought to be done. An-Nadim, not understanding this Greek word, simply transliterated it into pharagmatia, and referred elsewhere to a book of the precepts of the hearers, with a chapter appended on those of the elect. The book is named by MP 46 and called His Soft Sponge That Wipes Away Bruises, i.e. removes the injury done to soul by the corrupt flesh. It probably covered in greater detail the ground of our GMP 5466, and much of that dealt with in the closing chapters of the Kephaliah. Augustine, AMM 74, when speaking of a rule of life drawn from an epistle of Mani, is probably referring to one of the epistles 2, 13, 14, 19, 21, or 11. But these, in their turn, probably summarized or expatiated on parts of this lost book. In his refutation of Faustus, Augustine often seems to be citing this book, which must have spoken of the fasts and feasts, the offerings to the elect, the liturgy of hymns and psalms to be sung at home and in the churches, the rules for entry into religion, the 10 Commandments, and the 7 alms, the precepts of the elect governing their clothing, diet, non-possession, and ceaseless homelessness. In the preface to the Kephaliah, it ranks third after the Gospel and the Treasure. 6. The Book of the Giants, which MP 46 calls his excellent swabs, i.e. perhaps purifier. It is said to have been written in Syriac and then translated to Middle Persian, thence to Sogdian, and so to Old Turkish and Arabic, and also from Syriac direct to Greek. It was known to the later Byzantine and Muslim authors, and, as Al-Gandafar says, was full of stories of the great giants or heroes, Sam and Nariman, and the fallen watchers of primeval times. GY2A, drawn from Semitic and Iranian folklore. W. Henning, in his New Materialen zur Geschichte des Manikismus in the Bulletin of the School of Oriental and African Studies, 1943, Volume 2, collected many fragments of this book which had been found at Turfan and elsewhere, but it is hard to trace in these any coherent story. But there was evidently a close connection with the story found in 1st Enoch, Shamizad and Hobabish being clearly the Semiazas and Kobabiel of the earlier Jewish Apocryphon. In the Kephaliah 24, 27, and 92 through 93, there are allusions to this book, the name of which in Middle Persian seems to have been Kawan. The fragments we have are mostly in Uyghur Turkish, Sogdian, and Middle Persian. Apparently one section, M363, told how Jesus brought the religion to Sethel, Mani's prehistoric predecessor, and Enoch himself is in TM 323 and M101 911 called the Messenger, Kunok Burkan, 1st Enoch 1017. 7. The Book of the Letters, called by MP 46 the narthex vestibule of every cure, and by MP 139 the zeal of the elect, the joy of the hearers, the robe of the judgment of the righteousness. It was known to An-Nadim in the 10th century, and contains 76 epistles, mostly addressed to, or in some cases perhaps written by, individual disciples, or to churches, among which we may note India, Kashgar in Iraq, Armenia, Ctesiphon, Babylon, and Awaz, while others are named by their subjects. These last are very numerous, and seem to have been covered the whole field of Manichaean theology, ethics, liturgy, and social customs. Nothing could better restore our knowledge of this vanished religion than the much-to-be-desired discovery of this lost book. We have, in fact, considerable portions of Epistle 7, the great letter to Patek, thanks to Augustine's refutation of it, and Epistle 1, the famous book on the two principles or roots, must be largely on the lines of the first chapter in our present Gospel of the prophet Mani. A. The two principles. This seems to have been the main source used by Barconi, Alexander of Lycopolis, Titus of Bostra, Theodoret of Syra, and to have been used also by Severus of Antioch, An-Nadim, and the compiler of the Chinese text CMT. The Turkish hearer calls it this holy book of the two roots, and Song Kien says in the 13th century that in it men and women are taught not to marry or converse together, not to rely on human medicines, and to be buried quite without possessions, even nude. J.A. 1913, page 354. It seems to have covered much the same ground as the Treasure of Life, but without its copious details. B. The fundamental epistle seems to have been the one Manichaean work with which Augustine, as an African hearer of the 4th century, was really familiar, and of which he possessed a copy. He gives us long verbatim quotations, including the first words, which definitely recall the opening of the great Gospel, Mani, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the providence of God the Father. This form seems to be modeled on that of St. Paul, but it was quite a usual mode of address in the formal epistles of the age. The style shows the usual Oriental overloading with metaphor, and the rather long-winded sentences usual with Mani, in whichever language he is translated. There is not the slightest doubt that Augustine has kept exactly to his text, so far as he goes. Unhappily, he breaks it off in the middle, and isolated citations elsewhere do not help us to restore with certainty the argument of the latter half of the book, but they do suggest a fairly close parallel with the two roots, and seem to have covered the whole story of Satan's revolt, the creation of man around a spirit caught in matter, the mission of Jesus, and how evil was deceived by his ruse and his disguise, and so on to the last day with its heaven or hell as the fruit earned by every soul. This book was known to Ephrem as the essence of Manichaean faith, and it seems to have been the main source of Mardan Farouk and his Shikand-Gumanic Vijar. It is probably the book that was known in China as the Three Moments, i.e. Ages, and laid down by the Tunhuang Code and the Quastuanift as vital for converts. C. There are fragmentary references and citations from the epistles to Hata, M. 733, and to Menoch, the Virgin, Meson, M. 731, and perhaps a few others also. 8. The two Psalms, called by MP 139 the citadel of the angels, the life of the living, the day of the salvation of the hearers. In MP 46 this book is coupled with the words, and in the preface to the Kephaliah with the prayers of Mani. Both of these being probably the same, it was probably bound along therewith. The Kephaliah tells us that these three words are the expression of the whole doctrine. All that has been, all that shall be, is written in them. Page 5, line 28. It is just possible that from them are derived several passages we have used in GPM 36, 37, and 88, and they may well be reflected also in many passages of the Manichaean Psalm book, as also in S502. 9. The prayers of our Lord. This, noted in our Coptic text along with the foregoing, was evidently unknown in the West. It may well be the source for the long prayers recorded by MP and the Kephaliah as having been uttered by Mani in his last moments. I do not think it probable that An-Nadim's daily ritual of prayer is drawn from this book. It seems in its tone late or definitely secondary. The sources of our Gospel. A. Coptic. Inevitably, the first and main source is the wonderful group of original Manichaean books found in early Coptic translation in Egypt, so far as it has been available to me in published form. One day in 1930, a Cairo antiquity dealer offered Mr. A. Chester Beatty a bundle of inscribed papyrus evidently very ancient and taken from bound volumes. His story was that it came from a wooden box in the cellar of a ruined house at Medinat Madi in swampy land to the south of the Fayum. The damp, the crystallized salt in the desert water, the action of worms or white ants did great damage to the manuscript, sticking the pages so fast together that some could be parted only in fragments. The costly wooden cover, probably once inlaid with jewels, had been torn off, and the dealer himself had roughly broken the mass into smaller pieces so as to find easier sales. Indeed, it is a happy chance we have as much as we do have of this most tremendously important and unique find. Mr. Beatty at once bought it on the spot, entire, and handed it over for study to competent scholars. The whole mass was neatly written by several scribes in the sub-Akhmimit dialect on stout papyrus of very superior quality and buff white in color, slightly glossy in surface. It was bound together, but not as a roll, in the form of a codex, as was already known to have existed even in the 2nd century. It proved to fall into 3 natural groups of texts, most of which have now been published. One, the long-lost Kephaliah, Coptic Nkephalion Mispah, i.e. headings of the doctrine of the teacher. This book had been translated from Syriac, and it was in the 5th century regarded as a part of the Manichaean canon. It contains the record of conversations between Mani and his disciples not included in his own books, and may well have been written by about AD 275 to 280. The Coptic manuscript has been dated to about AD 340. It, or the published part of it, contains 95 chapters on varied topics on 244 pages. Some of these went to Vienna, while the bulk was printed with a German translation in 1935 to 1937 by Dr. Carl Schmidt, H. F. Polotsky, and Behling in Berlin. 2. The Manichaean Psalm Book, MP, written clearly and mostly in one fine handwriting on pages in size 27 by 17.5 centimeters, the writing covering on an average a space of 17 by 10.5 centimeters. It is believed to derive from an earlier Greek translation, save for the Psalms of Thomas, which seems to have come straight from Syriac, and may well have been written by AD 290 and translated by AD 325 or earlier. The other psalms written by Heraclides and others may have been translated by about AD 340. Our actual manuscript is dated by Schmidt at about 350 to 400. It may therefore even be a first copy of the original translation into Coptic. Many of the psalms have material form and great literary beauty, while the parallelism of older poetry is also found. The majority used refrains, and with a victory wish for certain saints or martyrs, among whom Mary is the most popular. Possibly she was a relative of the copyist. The meters are simple and have analogy with those of ancient Egypt and the Syriac texts of early Mandaean scriptures, to which the Psalms of Thomas are specially close. C.R.C. Albury published the second part of this book with an English translation in 1938. This has been available to me. Part 1 was then under study, and it is said to have included liturgical psalms for Sunday fasts, for vigils, and for the Paschal season. 45 pages in all, while Part 2 contains 234 pages, including a fragmentary index. A few additions stand in another hand, and the index covers only part of the extant text, which now includes 7 distinct collections with fragments of 2 others. This book is 4 centuries older than other known poetry in Coptic. 3. The Manichaean Homilies, M.H., consisting of 4 very early books of the utmost value to a portrait of Mani as man and as teacher. The Threnody of Salmai, Coptic Phrenos Salmaios, also written between AD 277 and 300 by a personal disciple. It bewails his cruel death and expresses eternal love for Mani. The story of the Great War, Coptic Plogos Polemos, Written by Pushtai, Mani's personal secretary, it purports to trace the history of the Church through an age of persecution to the age of peace and righteousness, with an apocalyptic story of the return of Jesus and the Last Judgment, based ultimately on the little apocalypse of Matthew 24:25, etc., and directly perhaps on parts of Mani's lost Shapura Khan. It has close parallels with the apocryphal Jewish apocalypses of Elijah, etc. The limb of the crucifixion, Coptic Phmeros Mtewo ha Satorosis, apparently an all but eyewitness account of events around Mani and his first two successors, from the death of Shapur I in AD 273 to the death of Bahram II, who granted tolerance in AD 294. It was certainly written within 9 years of this event, before Inai's martyrdom in AD 303. At the end comes a short but fervent epilogue on the greatness of Mani, who ascended to the light world, yet dwells with his church on earth. The whole collection may have been put together by Amu Amos, who is named, and a collaborator. The epilogue seems to have been added not much after AD 330 by the later editor, who translated the Syriac text into Coptic for the use of Egyptian Manichaeans. B. Chinese. 4. Moni Chao Siaput-san, British Museum, cited as BM. This is a long roll, 750 centimeters in length, well preserved. On the back are an account of Amitabha's light realm and other Buddhist works. This bespeaks the friendly relations of the two faiths at Tunhuang. Translated from Parthian, which the translator calls Sanskrit, into Chinese, it includes 27 hymns out of an original 3,000. As Tao Ming converted couplets into quatrains, he much enlarged his source and preserved for us a complete collection of hymns of his selection, including several of apostolic age by Sisin Amu and others. Some have even a phonetic transliteration of the original to facilitate their recitation by those ignorant of the meaning of the Parthian. Most have rubrics guiding their use. W. B. Henning published an English translation in the BSOAS 1943 and JRAS 1926, pages 116 to 122. There are in all 423 stanzas. 5. Moni Quang Fo Chao Fa Yi Liu, i.e., epitome of the religion of Mani, the Buddha of light. Usually cited as Chinese Manichaean text, CMT, this too was found at Tunhuang by Dolon in 1908, and it was published with French translation and valuable notes by Chavan and Pelliot in JA 1911, pages 499 to 621, and JA 1913, pages 99 to 383. This translation I have been content to use. Translated by imperial order in AD 731, the manuscript we have dates from about AD 1000. It contains portions derived from Mani's own books, probably mainly verbatim. 6. Rules for entering the religion, CRER, probably dating from the 8th century, were published by the same two scholars, with a French translation in JA 1913. C. Syriac. 7. Theodore Barkani's Scholia, K., written to refute Mani and other heretics, contains long passages which are almost certainly direct citations. The relevant portion was published by Pognon in 1898. Inscriptions Mande de Cu de Quabir, and again in Corpus Scriptorum Christianorum Orientalium, Scriptures Syriac 2, volume 66, which St. Mary's College at Kursong, Bengal, very kindly made available to me. 8. Ephraim Cyrus, whose refutations of Mani, Marcion, and Bardisson in C.W. Mitchell's 2 volumes, London 1912, of this only extracts cited by other authors have been available to me here. E.P.H. 9. Titus of Bostra, his refutations, cited as T.B., written in Syriac, has been available to me only in the Greek of Mignet, P.G. Volume 18, columns 1069 through 1264, kindly lent by St. Mary's College, also with many other sources. 10. Severus of Antioch, published in Cumon's Recherches les Manichees, Volume 1, Paris 1908, for the most part available in translations only. D. Arabic. 11. An-Nadim's Firist al-Ulum, N. A study of the pre-Muslim literatures of the Islamic world, including a most valuable account of Manichaeism from books and oral traditions extant in Baghdad late in the 10th century. There are 10 large pages in the Arabic text, which was published by Fleugel at Leipzig in 1872. His translation of 1862 was not traced out here. This work contains many verbatim and epitomized citations from the scriptures, lists of the epistles and of chapters in 2 books, and incidents from the history of the Church. An-Nadim's attitude is very fair and factual. 12. Al-Biruni's India and the Chronology of Ancient Nations, both translated by C.E. Sashow, 1879. I could not find a copy of the Arabic text. There are several direct quotations from the scriptures. E. Iranian. 13. Shikangumanik Vijar, S.G.V. in Pazend. Mardan Farooq, the Parsi scholar, about A.D. 860, reports the myth of man. Jackson publishes the next, along with West translation from S.B.E. Volume 24, Pahlavi Text 5. For a polemic writer, this author seems to have been very fair. 14. Turfan fragments, found in Central Asia after 1902, and published in various books, of which I have had only citations to use, made by Jackson, Alfaric, Reitzenstein, etc. Müller's Handschriftenrest in Estrangelo Schrift aus Turfan, 2 volumes, 1904, and C. Seilmann, Manichaeistudien 1, St. Petersburg, 1911, etc., many of these fragments being in Mani's original tongue, are probably his own words. 15. W. Henning, Ein Manichaees Bild und Beichtbuch, Berlin, 1939, cited as BUBB. 16. Andreas Henning, in 1932 through 1934, not available here in India. Marnamag, sadly broken fragments of a liturgy translated in the Book of Alfaric. Injunctions of Mani in Pahlavi, a caricature issued by Attarpat in the Denkart, and published with translation by Jackson. The author was minister of Shapur II, unable to look at Mani without hostile bias. F. Turkish, 19. The Quastunift, i.e. Own Confession, found by Stein in 1907 in the cave temple known as the Hall of 1,000 Pillars at Tunhuang. This is a roll 14 feet 8 inches long and 4 inches broad, supported on a stick of hard wood. Tough paper of the Tang period is covered in fine Manichaean script, the leaves of paper being carefully pasted together to form the roll. It contains in all 338 short lines and falls into 22 sections, each dealing with a particular group of sins. Another fragment is in Leningrad. This continues from line 28 but has no vowels written. It was published by Radloff in 1909. The whole text with English translation appeared in JRAS 1911, pages 277 to 314. In Lecoq's original publication, it bears the number T2D 178, 1 through 3. See our Appendix 2. 2. Turkish Manichaeica by A. von Lecoq, cited as T2D, etc., comprises fragments from Turkestan, many of them translated from Mani's original books. Here also I have had to rely on citations with fragments only of the Turkish text. G. Greek. 21. Hegemonius Acta Archelae, cited as H, published in Minier's PG 10, 1405 to 1528. Here we have a reliable account of Mani's teaching as seen from a hostile angle, yet remarkably fair. Hegemonius adds a wholly fictitious story of Mani's life, which was unintelligibly copied by later writers, and has prevailed in encyclopedias even to our own days. 22. Alexander of Lycopolis, Contra Manichae Opiniones, cited as AL, a briefer but valuable outline found in Migne's pg 18, 414. 23. Theodoratus, De Fabulis Hereticorum, cited as T, an angry but accurate comment on the myth story found in pg 83, 377 through 381. 24. Epiphanius Panarion, Chapter 66, found in pg 42, 29 through 172, and cited occasionally as E. This is a long-winded and almost wholly secondary account of very little value. 25. Serapion of Tmuis, Contra Manichaeos, a writing of very little importance and found in pg 40, 9d through 924. 26. The Greek abjuration of the 9th century is found in pg 1, 1461 through 1472. It gives a fair account for its late date. 27. Euodius, De Fide contra Manichaeos, a few passages from his extracts from Mani's own books have been cited here. H. Latin, 28. St. Augustine of Hippo, 388 to 405 A.D., one of our chief hostile authorities. His facts prove correct, but his arguments are worthless and often childish. His chief books on Manichaeism are On the Manners of the Manichaeans, A.M.M., Against Faustus, A.F., Against the Fundamental Epistle, F.E., On the Nature of the Good, N.B., and Against Fortunatus, P.L. 29. The Commonitorium, an abjuration found in PL 42 and translated in our Appendix 3. 30. Prosperous conversion from Manichaeism, dating from AD 526 at Lyon, an important refutation or anathema found in PL 65, 23 through 30, and in part translated in our Appendix 3. Through the courtesy of St. Mary's College, the rare and valuable set of Migne's Patrologies, Greek and Latin, was put at my disposal, and I was able to copy the text of most relevant passages. Other important sources from which I had to draw materials will be found noted in the bibliography. My work on gathering these materials was spread out over the years 1943 to 1954. A brief Manichaean catechism. 1. How did this universe come into existence? It has always existed on the subtler planes, two realms, one of light ruled by God and one of darkness ruled by the evil spirit. While evil erupted into the light realm, the physical universe was designed for their gradual separation. 2. What are the two sources? All existing things derive from one of these two, the infinite light of spiritual goodness, the bottomless darkness of evil matter, coexistent and totally opposed to one another. 3. What is God? The infinite and ineffable beneficent King of the light, manifesting himself in vast cosmic powers or emanations to overthrow the aggression of evil darkness on his spiritual realm, and also immanent throughout the universe. 4. Has the physical world any real existence? Certainly it is real, but it exists only until its purpose is achieved by the separation of the light and darkness. Compared with the light world's eternity, it is only a fleeting shadow dissipated by the dawn. 5. Is it good or evil? It is a mixture of good and evil, spirit and matter, light and darkness, so it will be dissolved when these eternal opposites are separated from each other, the light having been cleansed of all contaminating shadows. 6. Why was it created and by whom? The divine mind, or living spirit, fashioned it as a means of liberating soul from matter, the light sparks of God from the enslaving darkness, through the practice of the 12 virtues and the loving labors of the luminaries or saviors. 7. What is man? Man is a divine spirit imprisoned in a body of flesh created by the demons to ensnare his divinity in their world of darkness. 8. What is the individual soul? The soul is a spark of God's light, a part of his very being, separated off from him to be absorbed into the darkness of matter, and gradually to refine and purify as much of it as possible. Divine in source and end, its powers are limited while held captive in the body. What brought the body into being? Charmed by the spiritual beauty of the light, the demons of the darkness tried to capture it for themselves, so they made the body to draw the soul's attention away from God, its full perfection, to the lower pleasures of the flesh. 10. What is sin? Sin is the soul's disloyal turning from God to matter, accepting the sensual delights in place of spiritual ecstasy. Certain acts which tend to this have been listed as sins, such as violence, sex, lust, and possessiveness. 11. How did sin come into existence? Intoxicated by the light of God, the evil spirit rebelled against him and sought it for himself. This egoistic act of pride was the fountainhead of all sin. 12. Is matter eternal? Yes, it has existed from before time and will survive time itself, but it is only now that it is in revolt. It will at last be vanquished by the spirit, bound forever in the abyss, its powers totally destroyed. 13. What are the three moments? The past, wherein evil and good were wholly separate from each other, the present, wherein the former's aggression has caused a mingling and confusion of the two, the future, wherein they shall again be separated, the light in eternal peace and bliss, the darkness in the ruin of perpetual captivity. 14. Why did God create the individual soul? To cooperate with him in freeing all light or spirit from its slavery to matter, herself the first by warring ceaselessly with spiritual weapons on evil everywhere, and by helping to refine and uplift all beings, human, animal, plant, and even mineral. Through intimacy with the holiness of saints, this then is our duty on earth. 15. How was soul imprisoned in the flesh? Sent forth by God to enter and subdue rebellious matter from within, the soul is caught and swallowed up by the evil powers of its darkness, and forgets its real nature and its mission. Thus it becomes a miserable and helpless slave. 16. How can it become free? By uprooting the desires those evil powers personify, and by gradually refining and spiritualizing itself from all that is gross, material, it will at last be freed. 17. Can it do this unaided? Possibly, but in fact the soul is helped at every stage by God's grace and the assistance of his saints. 18. How does God help it to be free? Manifesting as intuition in the soul, as the light of conscience and of grace, he works from within, eliminating the vices and dark desires, and planting the fragrant flowers of every virtue in the heart. 19. What discipline should the soul follow? The mortifying of the flesh by chastity and prayer and fasting, the observance of total harmlessness, and a life of humility and loving kindness, with purity of thought and diet. 20. How does the evil spirit gain control of a man? When this mind is off its guard, evil thoughts and desires enter in through some weak point in his nature, opened by some sense impression. Then they encroach step by step until the whole has been corrupted. 21. How does the divine mind free him from that control? Entering the heart through the spoken word of God's messenger, it replaces all downward with upward tendencies, all vices with the opposite virtues, until the whole nature henceforth is a pure throne for the Christ to reign upon over his life. 22. Has man the power to choose aright? His power is limited only by the effects of his own past choices, which set up a habit only the utmost effort can break. This effort is made possible by the awakening call of God's messenger, Mani, Jesus, or another. 23. Is there such a thing as fate? Fate or destiny results from the individual soul's past choices of action, and it binds until those actions have been undone by other actions. It is therefore ultimately under our own control. 24. What causes the instability of moods? The soul is sometimes nearer to spirit, at times to matter, according to the prevailing planetary aspects in its horoscope, and to the purity or coarseness of the foods it allows the body to consume. 25. What is the reward of righteousness? The purifying of the individual soul from all defilement, and its victorious entry upon eternal life in the blissful land of light, with God and all the angels and happy souls. 26. What happens to the wicked? Those who deliberately prefer evil to good make the freeing of the soul from matter impossible for themselves. Then they take birth after wretched birth in matter till they become so grossly material that there can be no escape, and that is hell. 27. So Manichaeism teaches reincarnation. Yes, as a hell or as a purgatorial suffering involved in being attached to the fleshly body and its delights. Love for the body necessarily causes its reproduction age after age. 28. How do rebirths come to an end? When the soul turns from bodily desires to a full yearning after the spirit, from worldly pleasures to devotion for God, his messengers, and his church, it can no longer be born on a material plane, nor can it even wish to be. 29. What is death? Death is the temporary or final release of the spirit from its material prison. When the light spark is purified, death is its entry on eternal bliss and glory in God's realm of light. 30. What happens to the soul at death? The good, pure, righteous soul is adorned by the angels in its robes, crowns, and garlands of light, and led into the light kingdom. Ordinary souls are driven back on the paths to rebirth in the physical world. Evil souls are dragged by the demons into their hells of darkness, fire, and misery. 31. How does God check the victory of evil? He himself comes forth in some divine emanation to war upon and overthrow the evil, or he sends a messenger of the light to encourage and strengthen men in resisting it. 32. Can true knowledge be given by another? The saint or messenger of God comes to enlighten men with the teaching and the ethics, the wisdom and the righteousness which lead to freedom, but only those in whom the intuition or light mind is awake will welcome or benefit from his message. What then is the teacher's part? To awaken the soul to its own latent divinity, to guide it on the purifying path, to carry it through the liberating door of death into the endless glory of the Spirit. 34. What are the qualifications for this path? The knowledge that one is the soul and not the body, a firm resolve to live only for the spiritual aim, devotion to God and his church, which keeps that resolve a living power in the life, loving humility and gentleness to all, and persevering effort for self-purification. 35. Is it necessary to renounce the world? Yes, for its attractions must be overcome, and ultimately its standards and ways of living be abandoned. No, in the sense that it is here and in the world that the Church and each component soul must labor for God's plan of liberation until its purity has set it free forever.